It was the summer of 1950 when Gloria Swanson, once thought forgotten by the world that had adored her, stood again beneath the blinding lamps of Hollywood, her face lifted toward the camera in a role that blurred the line between her own fate and that of the character she embodied. Norma Desmond, a spectral remnant of the silent age, declared she was ready for her close-up, and for a breathless moment the past returned with a shiver of inevitability. Welcome, dear listener, to this slow and wandering remembrance. Before we drift deeper into this life, I ask you to share with me in the comments when and where you are listening, so that we may weave together a gentle circle of memory across the world. And if you wish to keep walking with us through the corridors of time, do not forget to press the subscribe button so the flame of history may burn quietly on. She was born in the chill of winter on March 27th in the year 1899 in Chicago, when that city was still half caught between the ashes of its great fire and the steel bones of its new buildings stretching toward heaven. Her father, Joseph Swanson, was a soldier, a man bound to discipline and to duty, and her mother, Adelaide, was a woman who carried with her the gentleness of domestic care, though beneath it lay the restlessness of constant relocations demanded by a military household. Gloria May Josephine Swanson entered life not as a destined goddess of the screen, but as a child shaped by the winds of uncertainty, moved from post to post, each dwelling never quite her own. Can we not wonder, then, if her later hunger for permanence in glamour, jewels, and marble palaces was but an answer to the unsettled rhythms of her youth? In those early years, there was little to mark her apart from other children. She laughed in schoolrooms, she played along dusty roads, she heard the call of bugles from parade grounds. Yet the world of entertainment, of staged make-believe, lingered near. Chicago, after all, was alive with vaudeville, with Nickelodeons where, for the price of a few pennies, stories unrolled in flickering black and white. To a young girl whose life was scattered by her father's assignments, those shadows on the screen may have appeared like a secret promise, a realm where chaos could be bound into tales that made sense. Her father's strictness perhaps gave her that straight-backed poise, the regal bearing that would later make audiences believe she was born a queen among mortals. But behind discipline, there was also affection, and Gloria remembered him with warmth. He would retire from service when she was still young, but his worldliness, his sharp sense of dignity, lingered in her. One wonders whether her lifelong insistence on command, on being the center of her universe, was not learned in part from watching him, a figure of order in a restless household. The family moved to Puerto Rico for a time, when her father was stationed there, and the young Gloria absorbed the sights and scents of that island, its vivid colors, its swaying palms, the cadence of Spanish voices. Later, she would claim that it was there she learned to appreciate finery and color, the richness of fabrics, and the art of display. Was this true memory, or the embroidery of recollection by a woman who always sought to weave beauty into her own past? We cannot know, yet the idea pleases us, that the girl who would one day wear costumes dripping in pearls once gazed with wide eyes upon the bright skirts of island women. She was educated in Catholic schools, where discipline was again the rule. Yet teachers remembered her as dreamy, prone to wander in imagination, as though already hearing faintly the music of another destiny. Still, in those days, the cinema was scarcely a profession, more a novelty, and no one could have said with certainty that the young Gloria Swanson would soon walk into history. She herself did not yet dream of it. Her thoughts were those of a girl longing for stability, perhaps for romance, perhaps simply for a life that seemed larger than the one allotted her. When the family returned from the island, Chicago had grown yet busier, its factories roaring, its streets alive with a restless hum. Gloria, now a teenager, found herself caught between the modest means of her parents and the allure of a city of wealth and show. She wished to dress finely, to move with elegance, though the family's purse was often thin. In these early tensions between desire and reality, the seeds were planted for what would later become her lifelong struggle, the urge to live as a queen even when the throne was unsteady. It was by accident, or by the slow hand of fate, that cinema first beckoned. A cousin, fond of the novelty of moving pictures, persuaded her to visit the S&A studios in Chicago. She went not with ambition, but with curiosity, a young girl stepping into a new world for amusement. Yet there, among painted backdrops and actors pretending at life, she felt a sudden stirring. The cameras turned, the lights burned hot, and extras drifted like shadows through scenes. Gloria's face, delicate and expressive, caught the eye of those present. Soon she found herself hired in the smallest of roles, a background figure in the silent dramas, then being turned out in rapid succession. These were humble beginnings, fleeting appearances, wages scarcely more than a clerk might earn. But for Gloria, the sensation of being in front of a camera was unlike anything she had known. The world that had shifted beneath her all her young life suddenly felt as though it had a fixed center, and that center was her. In those early flickers, she learned to move with awareness, to gesture with restraint, to let her eyes speak where words could not. Silent film demanded no voice, only presence, and presence was the very gift that seemed to bloom naturally within her. Her parents were cautious, even disapproving. What respectability could lie in this new, half-mocking art of cinema? For many, acting was still suspect, a field for the frivolous or the fallen. Yet Gloria pressed on, drawn as if by a current she could not resist. The discipline of her upbringing gave her the patience to endure endless takes, to follow direction, to study the ways of other performers. She was still a teenager, but already a woman was forming, a woman who understood the alchemy by which the ordinary might be transformed into the extraordinary. One day, as she lingered in a corner of the studio, she watched a scene in which a woman collapsed in despair. Gloria studied not the theatrics, but the way the actress held her hands, the pause before the fall, the silence that seemed to echo louder than the gesture itself. Later, she would confess that in those moments she realized emotion was not to be flung, but to be measured, suggested, made luminous by restraint. Perhaps this was the birth of the Swanson style, that strange mingling of grandeur and subtlety that would carry her through decades. Still, she was only at the threshold. The S&A studios would soon decline, its glory days passing, and with it, her first steps seemed almost to vanish like footprints in sand. Yet destiny was at work, for in leaving S&A, she would soon be drawn toward Paramount and into the orbit of Cecil B. DeMille, who would shape her into the dazzling star the world remembers. But that, dear listener, belongs to the next part of our tale. For now, let us linger in that quiet studio in Chicago, where a young girl first felt the brush of light upon her face, not knowing that it was the first flicker of a flame that would burn across the world. The lamps buzz faintly, the reels turn, and the image of a wide-eyed Gloria fades into shadow, waiting for her next scene. The quiet studio in Chicago, with its dim lamps and reels that turned with a faint and uncertain hum, slowly released her into the wider world. The image of the wide-eyed girl lingered, then dissolved, and in its place came a figure slightly older, with eyes no less curious, but with steps now carrying her toward another door. When the S&A days drew to their close, Gloria Swanson found herself in that delicate space between chance and obscurity, when one may vanish back into ordinary life or else be carried further into mystery. The studio had once been bustling, but its fortune waned, its lights flickered out, and Gloria, unwilling to drift into the silence of forgotten work, began to seek elsewhere. It was then that Paramount, with its grander ambitions, opened a path, and through that gate she entered the presence of one who would alter her life, Cecil B. DeMille. In Hollywood, though still young, DeMille was already becoming a figure larger than any single film, a craftsman of spectacle who believed that moving pictures could be made into something resembling grandeur. He was restless, always searching for faces that might hold the screen like an icon holds the gaze of a worshiper. When Gloria was brought before him, she was not yet polished, not yet wrapped in the finery that would later define her image. But he sensed at once her ability to command attention. She was not merely pretty, though beauty she had. There was something about the shape of her eyes, the determination of her posture, the restrained flicker of her smile. She seemed aware that she might carry a crown, even if it was not yet placed upon her head. DeMille tested her, placed her in small roles, in moments that demanded both allure and dignity. She learned to stand not as a chorus girl might, with eagerness, but with the calm of one who expects admiration rather than asks for it. Costume followed role, and soon she was arrayed in silks, jewels, furs. The films of DeMille delighted in lavishness, in making the audience dream of pleasures beyond their reach, and Gloria, once the daughter of a modest military household, was suddenly enveloped in excess. She wore pearls the size of marbles, gowns stitched with elaborate embroidery, tiaras that flashed under the new, more powerful lamps of the studio. To see her on screen was to see not a girl of Chicago, but a goddess fashioned for the jazz age. It is worth pausing to wonder, did she become a diva because the role was written for her, or was the role written because she was always one? Some say that DeMille, with his genius for spectacle, simply uncovered what was already present, coaxing from her the regal gestures, the raised chin, the magnetic silence. Others believe she was an actress who merely obeyed direction, molded into a figure she might never have become alone. But to watch her, even in those early films, is to sense an authority too natural to be borrowed. She had learned the art of stillness, the way of holding the screen by seeming to hold something back. Audiences responded with wonder. They saw not only beauty, but command. Here was a woman who seemed untouchable, who belonged not in the crowd, but above it. In the 1910s, when cinema was still regarded as cheap entertainment by some, she elevated the form. Middle-class women who might have looked with suspicion upon actresses found themselves imitating her costumes, her hairstyles, her way of walking into a room as if it were a stage. She became a model not just for desire, but for aspiration. Women went to the pictures and left wondering if they too could carry themselves with such composure. Men went and left with a memory that glowed long into the evening. Behind the camera, Gloria worked tirelessly. She was no idle beauty waiting for applause. She studied, she rehearsed, she learned how light fell upon a cheek, how to move an arm so that fabric shimmered. DeMille admired her discipline, and though he might direct her with authority, she absorbed instruction with a seriousness that astonished her peers. Already, she showed signs of a mind that wanted to shape her own destiny, not merely be shaped by others. Later, she would seek control of her own productions, but the seed of that independence was here, in these early collaborations. As her fame grew, so too did the sense of her difference from the ordinary. Friends from childhood scarcely recognized her now, adorned in gowns and pearls on the screen. Yet the young woman behind the costume still carried fragments of her earlier life. She had not forgotten the uncertainty of moving from post to post, the modest rooms of military quarters, the simplicity of her mother's care. Perhaps this memory deepened her hunger for permanence and luxury, for palaces built not on shifting orders, but on her own command. It is often in contrast that desire sharpens most fiercely. The Paramount years unfolded swiftly. Each film, while often melodramatic by later standards, was another step in her transformation. By 1919, she was recognized as one of the studio's brightest stars, her face appearing in magazines, her name whispered in admiration. America, caught in the rhythms of post-war change, sought new images of glamour and release, and Gloria Swanson was there to embody them. She represented both aspiration and escape, a figure both near and impossibly far, Yet even then, beneath the gleam, small shadows gathered. To play a goddess was intoxicating, but it also distanced her from ordinary affection. Suitors arrived, marriages began and faltered, and already whispers of her private life mingled with her professional rise. For a woman of barely 20, she bore the weight of immense attention, a burden that thrilled but also isolated. Did she already sense, in those heady days, the fragility of a life built on illusion? Or did the applause drown all doubt, leaving only the certainty of her own grandeur? She walked now through studio corridors with the calm assurance of one who belonged. Yet, at night perhaps, she wondered if the role she played was swallowing the girl she had been. The line between Gloria the woman and Gloria the goddess grew fainter, and as with many who rise swiftly, she may have wondered who she truly was when the lamps were turned off. And still, the costumes grew heavier, the jewels brighter, the stories more extravagant. DeMille, pleased with his creation, placed her at the center of spectacles where desire and morality collided in ornate dramas. The audiences gasped, the critics marveled, and Gloria Swanson stepped deeper into the myth that would one day both exalt and consume her. As this chapter of her life closes, let us leave her in a moment of stillness on set, the lamps blazing, the pearls gleaming against her gown, as DeMille lifts his hand to signal another take. The camera whirs, the silence deepens, and Gloria's eyes, filled with command and mystery, gaze past the lens into a world that seems entirely hers. But the applause that will greet her masks a whisper that will never cease. What price is paid for such radiance? The pearls gleam under studio lights, and with that gleam, we step toward another chapter, where applause grows louder even as the whispers of gossip begin to circle more closely. The pearls gleamed under the studio lights, their surfaces catching reflections of both brilliance and fragility, and as those small orbs shimmered, they became symbols of the transformation unfolding before the eyes of the world. What had once been a curious young girl on the peripheries of a Chicago studio now appeared as an icon, poised, deliberate, a figure meant to be gazed upon as though she were the embodiment of beauty itself. With each new production, Gloria Swanson was fashioned further into the eternal diva, her image inseparable from the grandeur that Cecil B. DeMille so loved to stage. The silent films of the late 19-teens and early 20s required not only dramatic poses, but the ability to project emotion through restraint. And Gloria, more than most, mastered this art. She moved less like an actress trying to convey, and more like a figure through whom emotion simply passed, luminous yet controlled, her every glance calibrated to draw and to hold. Audiences did not merely watch her, they revered her. The jazz age was dawning, and in its rhythms and excesses there was a hunger for symbols, for larger-than-life embodiments of extravagance. Gloria Swanson, draped in silks and jewels, carrying herself with the hauteur of a queen, became precisely that symbol. To see her glide across the screen was to enter a realm where dreams were realized in fabrics and faces, where the grim struggles of daily life melted away in the assurance that perfection existed, even if only in the fleeting frames of a motion picture. She played queens, society women, temptresses, and saints, each role wrapped in costumes so elaborate they seemed to weigh as much as the roles themselves. DeMille's love of spectacle required gowns dripping with beads, headpieces reaching heavenward, and sets that evoked palaces. Within this spectacle, Gloria stood at the center, commanding attention without a word. She embodied the paradox of silent cinema, voiceless yet resounding, still yet endlessly alive. Even her critics admitted that her screen presence was uncanny, as though she carried with her an aura that refused to be ignored. As Paramount promoted her more vigorously, her image began to flood magazines and newspapers. Fan letters arrived by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Women copied her style, sought dresses that might echo her gowns, and imitated her hairstyles. She was no longer merely a performer. She was an arbiter of taste, a queen of glamour presiding over an empire of admirers. Yet beneath the sheen of admiration, one wonders if Gloria herself began to feel the subtle strain of sustaining an image so carefully constructed. For behind every appearance lay hours of preparation, fittings and rehearsals, and beneath every costume lay the body of a woman still barely into her 20s, learning how to live while the world insisted she already embody perfection. Her relationship with DeMille deepened professionally, for he was both her mentor and her collaborator. He understood her ability to hold the screen, and she understood his vision for cinema as a spectacle that could rival theater and painting. Their films together were not merely entertainments, they were events. Crowds flocked to see her, and the industry recognized that she was fast becoming one of Paramount's greatest assets. Yet success often carries its own burdens. With every triumph, expectation grew heavier, and the public's fascination with her personal life began to stir as insistently as their love for her roles. In the studios, she commanded respect, though sometimes envy followed her footsteps. Fellow actresses whispered of her growing demands, of her insistence on being treated as the star she knew herself to be. Yet these whispers, while perhaps sharpened by jealousy, also reflected a truth. Gloria was learning to seize control of her destiny, to refuse to be merely a player in someone else's game. Even in these early years, she showed signs of wanting creative authority, a desire that would later lead her into the risky world of producing her own films. But for now, she allowed herself to be guided by DeMille, basking in the light he directed upon her, while quietly shaping her own understanding of how the machinery of cinema worked. Her personal life, however, was less ordered than her professional ascent. Already she had married once, to a fellow actor, though the union was brief and ill-fated. Love seemed to her both intoxicating and elusive, arriving with passion but quickly fading beneath the weight of her rising fame. She longed for companionship, yet her life was no longer ordinary. She could not easily belong to anyone outside the orbit of her growing stardom. Men admired her, courted her, but few could withstand the intensity of her fame, nor the demands of her ambition. Thus, even in the early flowering of her career, loneliness began to weave its quiet thread through her story. And yet to the public she was radiant. In film after film, she carried herself with dignity, with elegance, with the assurance of one who was destined to be adored. Photographers loved her face, and she quickly learned how to angle herself so that every image seemed iconic. In an age before spoken dialogue, when faces were the sole carriers of story, she perfected the art of expressing volumes through the smallest shifts of expression. A raised brow, a slight turn of the mouth, a long, steady gaze, these became her language, and audiences read it with fascination. By 1920, Gloria Swanson was no longer a rising star. She was already one of the brightest lights of the silent screen. Paramount poured resources into her films, dressing her in more elaborate costumes, placing her in grander sets. Each role reinforced the image of her as a woman, set apart from the ordinary. But even as she grew in prominence, she remained, in her own private heart, a woman searching for stability, for love, for meaning beyond the silks and jewels. This tension between the public goddess and the private seeker would mark her life ever after. At the close of one of her shoots, as the lamps cooled and the set fell into silence, Gloria sat alone, still clad in a gown heavy with beads. The pearls at her neck felt less like ornaments than burdens, weighing upon her with an invisible demand to shine, always, without falter. In that moment, perhaps, she felt both the triumph and the loneliness of her station. She was adored, yes, but also trapped within an image that left little room for the fragile, searching woman she still was beneath the finery. The pearls, gleaming as the lights dimmed, seemed to whisper both promise and warning. They promised adoration, wealth, and immortality, but they warned of the chains that glamour forges, chains as unyielding as iron, though disguised as beauty. And so, as we step beyond this scene, we follow her into the years when her reign would grow ever more dazzling, when she would ascend as the unrivaled queen of the jazz age, even as the shadows of gossip and disquiet began to circle her throne. The distant applause still echoed, fading into whispers, and those whispers now become our path forward, carrying us into the next chapter, where the diva's fame would shine brighter, and yet where faint tremors of unease would begin to stir. The distant applause faded into whispers, and those whispers, carried like a faint breeze through the corridors of Hollywood, soon swelled into a chorus that both exalted and scrutinized the young star. Gloria Swanson, wrapped in pearls and silks, no longer belonged to herself alone. She was claimed by an age, an era of restless energy, where champagne foamed in endless towers, where jazz spilled from dance halls into midnight streets, where women bobbed their hair and shortened their skirts, daring to live as boldly as their desires demanded. It was the jazz age, and Gloria became one of its chosen emblems, her screen image reflecting and shaping the fever of the times. As the 1920s dawned, America shed the weight of war and sought release in pleasure, in extravagance, in the creation of idols who embodied freedom from restraint. Gloria's face, with its sculpted elegance, seemed to belong to this new world. She was not the demure heroine of earlier days, nor the purely comic figure of slapstick reels. She was something more modern, more commanding, and her films often revealed women who were unafraid to pursue what they desired, whether love, wealth, or independence. Audiences found in her both escape and permission, the dream of living larger than life, and the suggestion that such living was possible. Paramount, recognizing the power of their star, lavished resources upon her. Sets became ever more elaborate, costumes heavier with jewels, stories crafted to place her at the center of grandeur. She played countesses and empresses, society leaders and powerful seductresses. In each role, her presence conveyed not only allure, but authority. Unlike some contemporaries whose appeal rested on fragility or innocence, Gloria's magnetism came from strength. She did not merely await destiny, she seemed to command it. This quality, rare for actresses of the silent era, made her a figure of both admiration and controversy. Some critics found her characters too imperious, too untouchable, yet audiences continued to flock to see her, drawn by the fascination of a woman who appeared to bow to no one. Off-screen, she lived in ways that mirrored her on-screen image. She began to indulge in the luxuries her career afforded: fashionable gowns from Paris, jewels of extraordinary size, houses furnished with rare antiques. Reporters followed her with eager pens, documenting her appearances at social gatherings, her entrances into restaurants and clubs, her extravagant purchases. She seemed to exist as a living continuation of the roles she played, a diva not only before the camera but in every sphere of life. Yet beneath the glitter, questions lingered. Did she pursue such extravagance because it pleased her, or because she felt compelled to sustain the image audiences demanded? Was she still Gloria, the girl from Chicago, or had she become wholly the creation of public imagination? The jazz age thrived on contradictions, liberation shadowed by anxiety, glamour built upon fragility, laughter masking the disquiet of change. Gloria, too, embodied these contradictions. She was celebrated for her independence, her willingness to defy conventions, her command of the screen. Yet in her personal life, she longed for constancy, for affection that might survive the storms of fame. Her marriages faltered, her romances often collapsed beneath the pressure of her career. The newspapers that praised her elegance also relished in recounting her personal difficulties, for in the jazz age, scandal was as eagerly consumed as spectacle. Still, she rose ever higher. Her films became international events, and her name traveled across oceans. European audiences, already inclined toward aristocratic glamour, embraced her with fervor, while American fans regarded her as the embodiment of their own daring age. Young women imitated her hairstyles, draped themselves in imitation jewels, and walked with a touch of her regal bearing. Gloria Swanson was not merely an actress. She was a style, a presence, a way of being that others longed to borrow. At times, she herself confessed fatigue at the endless demands of sustaining this life. The costumes were heavy, the jewels uncomfortable, the stories often repetitive. Yet she persevered, understanding that each role, each film, added another layer to the legend. She began to view her career not only as a profession but as a work of art, an ongoing construction of an image that might outlast the fleeting moment. Was this foresight or self-deception? We cannot know. Yet it reveals the depth of her awareness that she was engaged in something larger than herself, a performance that extended beyond the screen into the very fabric of cultural memory. There were evenings when she appeared at gatherings in gowns, shimmering with sequins, laughter surrounding her, music from jazz bands throbbing in the air. In those moments, she seemed the very spirit of the age, untouchable, glowing with the vitality of the 20s. Yet perhaps, as dawn crept in and the music quieted, she felt again the old uncertainty, the longing for something more enduring than applause. Fame is intoxicating, but it does not fill the silences of the heart. The jazz age adored excess, and Gloria offered it without hesitation. Yet within that excess lay the seeds of strain. The newspapers that once described her as divine began to note the extravagance of her spending, the instability of her personal affairs. Gossip trailed her like a shadow, at once feeding her fame and threatening it. The applause that rose in theaters could quickly turn into murmurs of criticism, for the public, fickle in its loves, often delights in watching idols stumble. Still, in the early 1920s, she reigned supreme. No actress carried the same blend of authority and glamour. No image more perfectly captured the daring spirit of the time. The jazz age needed its goddess, and Gloria Swanson fulfilled the role with brilliance. Yet even as she stood crowned in jewels and adoration, the faint whisper of fragility remained, a reminder that every age of excess carries within it the promise of decline. And so, as we leave her in this chapter, poised in the full glow of jazz-age glory, let us imagine her stepping from a studio set into a waiting car, the flashbulbs of photographers bright against the night. She smiles, regal and serene, her pearls glinting, her gown flowing, as applause lingers faintly in the distance. But behind that applause, another sound rises, the first whispers of gossip, soft but insistent, echoing like a warning in the midst of celebration. The whispers drift into the night, and they lead us onward, into a dressing room where a letter lies unanswered upon a table, its presence a silent witness to the storms of love and loss about to enter her story. The unanswered letter lay upon the dressing table, its envelope faintly smudged by fingers that had opened it, eyes that had scanned its words, and a heart that had hesitated to reply. In that quiet room behind the glamour of the stage, a more fragile truth revealed itself, for no matter how radiant she appeared in silks and jewels, Gloria Swanson was also a woman whose life was marked by love sought and love lost. Just as her career rose into brilliance, her personal affairs often slipped into disarray, as though the weight of adoration upon the screen made ordinary tenderness too difficult to sustain. Her first marriage, to Wallace Beery, had begun in the shadows of her youth. He was older, more experienced, a man of presence in the early studios, but the union was doomed almost from the start. The glamour of Hollywood had not yet enveloped her, and perhaps she had hoped for stability, for guidance from a man who seemed strong. Yet what she found instead was cruelty, a husband who drank heavily, who grew resentful of her rising fame, who sought to control what could not be contained. Their time together was brief and bitter, and when it ended, Gloria carried with her not only sorrow but a determination that she would never again surrender her destiny to another's command. The years that followed brought other romances, other marriages, each beginning with the fever of promise and each fading under the strain of her extraordinary life. She married Herbert K. Somborn, a restaurateur whose world was far from the palaces of cinema, and together they had a daughter, Gloria Swanson's only child. For a time, the presence of a child softened her, drew her into the intimacy of motherhood. She adored her daughter, found in her a rare constancy amid the tumult of stardom. Yet even this marriage unraveled, undone by jealousy, by differences too vast to bridge, by the ever-present scrutiny of the public eye. The newspapers whispered of quarrels, of accusations, of Somborn's discomfort at living in the shadow of his wife's fame. When the marriage dissolved, Gloria fought to keep her child close, vowing that though men might come and go, she would remain steadfast as a mother. Another marriage followed, this time to Henri de la Falaise, a French nobleman whose title carried a promise of aristocratic glamour that seemed to suit her screen image. For a time, it was as though life and film had merged, the diva marrying into nobility, a union that enchanted fans who saw in it the realization of fairy tales. Yet behind the glitter lay familiar patterns, the clash of ambition, the strain of living within constant attention, the inability of passion to endure against the demands of her career. Again, the union faltered, leaving behind memories of parties and gowns, but not the enduring love she had longed for. Why did her romances collapse so often? Was it the relentless pressure of fame, the impossibility of balancing devotion to art with devotion to another? Or was it that Gloria herself, accustomed to command and adoration, found it difficult to yield to the compromises that marriage demands? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Love is fragile, even for those who live quietly, and for one who lived perpetually before the gaze of millions, it may have been nearly impossible. Through it all, gossip magazines fed upon her private life, recording each union, each separation, with a hunger that both fascinated and wounded. Fans devoured these stories, marveling at the diva who seemed to live as dramatically off-screen as she did on-screen. But for Gloria, these stories were not mere amusements. They were the fabric of her life, stitched with longing, disappointment, and the ache of solitude. Even as she was adored by strangers, she yearned for the simple constancy of being loved by one. And yet, each heartbreak seemed only to deepen her artistry. On the screen, her portrayals of desire, of passion pursued and lost, carried a weight that seemed drawn from her own life. She could gaze with longing, turn away in sorrow, collapse in silent despair, and audiences felt the truth of it. For though cinema was illusion, the emotions she carried into it were real. In this way, her failed romances became part of her gift to the world, transforming her private pain into public beauty. Still, the cost was heavy. Between sets and travels, between gossip and applause, Gloria sometimes found herself alone in hotel rooms, letters unanswered, photographs of loved ones near, but not sufficient to fill the silence. In such moments, the jewels and gowns meant little. The applause faded quickly, and only the ache of incompleteness remained. Did she ever ask herself if she had chosen wrongly, if she had pursued fame at the expense of happiness? Perhaps she did, perhaps she did not. But the truth is more subtle. For Gloria Swanson, fame was not simply chosen, it was inevitable, woven into her very being. To refuse it would have been to refuse herself. In one such dressing room, the unanswered letter remained, a token of love once offered and left without reply. Its edges curled with time, its ink faded slightly, but it bore witness to the fragility of human bonds in a life that glittered outwardly, but trembled inwardly. To see her on the screen was to believe in her command, her independence, her divine aura. But to glimpse her in these private moments was to see a woman whose heart remained tender, yearning, often wounded. The unanswered letter stays with us now, leading us onward. For even as she faced heartbreak, she continued to live extravagantly, to surround herself with finery, as though beauty itself might shield her from sorrow. And so, we follow her into the grand houses, the Paris fashions, the jewels that glittered like stars, and the lavishness that became both her triumph and her ruin. The unanswered letter, left behind on the dressing table, seemed to dissolve into the glitter of jewels and the rustle of gowns, for Gloria Swanson, wounded though she might have been in love, did not withdraw into sorrow. Instead, she surrounded herself with beauty, as if the very weight of finery could shield her heart from disappointment. The path she chose was one of extravagance, of palaces and pearls, of indulgence in every form of luxury that the Jazz Age offered. To her admirers, it appeared as though she lived in perpetual radiance, untouched by common cares. Yet to those who looked more closely, it was possible to sense that this grandeur was not only an expression of joy, but also a mask, a fortress built against the quiet ache of emptiness. Her fame had brought wealth, and with wealth came the possibility of living as queens once had, not in the dim light of a modest home, but in mansions where every room declared power. She purchased grand houses, filled them with antiques from Europe, commissioned artists to decorate her walls. Her taste was not merely for comfort, but for magnificence. She adorned herself with jewels of extraordinary size, diamonds that sparkled like frozen stars, pearls that cascaded over her shoulders in shimmering strands. To appear on screen in jewels was one matter, but Gloria also carried such adornments into her daily life, transforming even an ordinary dinner into a spectacle of elegance. Paris became her second home, for it was in that city of fashion that she found the styles that defined her image. She walked through salons where designers draped her in gowns of satin and velvet, of lace and chiffon, each garment made not merely to be worn, but to be seen, admired, remembered. She became a patron of couturiers who delighted in crafting visions that could only belong to her. American newspapers reported breathlessly on her visits to Paris fashion houses, describing the gowns she purchased, the hats she selected, the fabrics she chose. Through her, styles crossed oceans, shaping the tastes of women who longed to imitate the diva's elegance. Yet extravagance is never only beauty, it is also burden. The more she possessed, the more she felt compelled to acquire. As if to maintain her throne, she must surround herself with ever greater finery. Friends recalled the endless stream of gowns, of trunks filled with silks and furs, of jewels kept in elaborate cases. Gloria's homes were not simply places of rest, but stages upon which she performed her daily life, every room another set, every meal another scene. The press adored it, and fans marveled at her splendor. But within the silence of her houses, when the lights were dimmed, the grandeur could feel like a hollow echo, filling the spaces that love had left vacant. It is possible to ask, did she truly delight in these luxuries, or did she cling to them as one clings to a shield? She herself often spoke of her love for fashion, for art, for beauty. Yet she also admitted in later years that she sometimes felt trapped by the image she had created, compelled to live up to the expectations of others. To appear in public without jewels, without the aura of magnificence, seemed unthinkable. She had become not only Gloria Swanson the woman, but Gloria Swanson the myth, and myths cannot dress plainly. Meanwhile, her finances, though buoyed by high salaries, strained under the weight of such living. Hollywood paid her lavishly, yet the costs of her lifestyle, her travels, her wardrobes, were immense. Bankers and advisors whispered of the dangers of overspending, but Gloria, swept along by the rhythm of the age, could not or would not slow her indulgence. To do so would have felt like admitting defeat, as though by relinquishing extravagance, she would also relinquish her identity. Her friends and contemporaries sometimes envied her splendor, sometimes pitied it. Some saw her as a woman who had mastered the art of life, who had turned existence itself into a performance of beauty. Others saw her as a woman caught in her own illusion, living in palaces while her heart remained unquiet. Both were true, for in Gloria Swanson, magnificence and melancholy were always intertwined. At parties, she dazzled. She entered rooms with gowns that shimmered beneath the light, jewels that caught every gaze, and a bearing that silenced conversation. Men admired her with awe, women studied her for inspiration. The press described her as though she were a queen reborn in the modern world. Yet even amid the music, the laughter, the endless pouring of champagne, she sometimes drifted into quiet, her gaze far away, as though listening for something that never came. Those who knew her well sensed in these moments that the diva's heart still longed for simplicity, for affection unclouded by spectacle. Her extravagance extended beyond fashion into every corner of her existence. She collected art, antiques, curiosities from around the world. She dined at the finest restaurants, traveled in luxury, surrounded herself with attendants who ensured that every detail of her life shone. The public marveled at stories of her palaces and possessions, yet such stories, though enchanting, also carried a hint of unease. For in the heart of every tale of excess lies the shadow of downfall. And indeed, even as Gloria's image reached new heights, her finances began to unravel. The money that flowed so quickly through her fingers did not always return in equal measure. Investments failed, expenses multiplied, debts whispered at the edges of her empire. She ignored them as long as she could, continuing to surround herself with grandeur, as though the very presence of beauty might ward off ruin. Yet the truth, inexorable and cold, was that her extravagance carried a price that applause could not pay. Still, for the time being, she continued to reign. Audiences saw only the splendor, the jewels, the gowns, the commanding presence on screen. They did not hear the quiet knock of creditors at her door, nor the uneasy calculations whispered in offices. For them, she remained the eternal diva, the goddess of silent cinema. And perhaps for herself as well, she clung to this image, unwilling to let the shadows intrude upon the light. Let us pause with her in one of her great houses, the lamps glowing, the air scented with perfume, gowns hanging in endless rows, jewels laid upon velvet trays. She stands before a mirror, radiant, her reflection confirming the myth she has built. Yet in the silence beyond the mirror, another sound lingers. The echo of footsteps in distant marble halls, the measured tread of bankers, of creditors, drawing nearer. And so we leave her here, still surrounded by finery, still radiant in her fortress of jewels and gowns, but with faint echoes gathering beyond the gates. For the extravagance that now shields her will soon become the very weight that threatens to undo her, as footsteps grow louder in the corridors of her fortune. The echo of footsteps in marble halls grew louder, firm and deliberate, like the measured ticking of a clock that cannot be stopped. Behind the locked doors of grand offices, where ledgers whispered truths that jewels could not conceal, Gloria Swanson's extravagance was being tallied and weighed. Creditors, bankers, and advisors came with solemn words, speaking of debts, of obligations, of the limits that even stars must heed. Yet to Gloria, whose life had been built upon illusion transformed into reality, such words seemed like intrusions from a world she had long since left behind. She laughed, she dismissed, she moved forward with the same glittering confidence she carried on screen, though inside her heart may have trembled. The fall did not come all at once. It came in murmurs, in warnings she chose to ignore, in sums that grew larger with each passing month. The gowns from Paris, the houses filled with antiques, the jewels that sparkled like captured constellations, all carried with them costs that no applause could erase. And yet how could she, the eternal diva, admit to the world that behind the splendor lay instability? To do so would have been to confess weakness, to reveal that the goddess was, in truth, a woman beset by earthly burdens. Her solution was not to retreat, but to continue forward, to embrace extravagance even more fiercely, as though defiance itself might keep ruin at bay. Parties grew no less lavish, gowns no less elaborate, jewels no less dazzling. Friends observed her with admiration tinged by unease, wondering how long such a life could be sustained. Some whispered that she lived as though tomorrow would never come, as though she believed the world would always provide for its queen. Perhaps she did believe it, or perhaps she simply could not imagine another way of being. On the screen, her characters reflected this same paradox. They lived in splendor, commanded adoration, pursued desires without restraint. Audiences, unaware of her financial troubles, continued to marvel, seeing only the brilliance and never the burden. And so the illusion endured, strengthened by the very stories that mirrored her own life. The more she faltered in private, the more she seemed invincible in public. It was as if she poured her anxieties into the screen, transforming them into the radiant poise that left spectators breathless. Yet debts are patient, waiting quietly while the illusion shines. And soon the murmurs of bankers became insistent. Letters arrived, demands sharpened, and the shadow of financial ruin lengthened across her glittering stage. For many, such a reckoning would have meant retreat, humility, the acceptance of limits. But Gloria Swanson, shaped by years of command, refused to bow easily. She began to seek new ventures, new projects, ways of regaining control over her fortune. If others could dictate the roles she played, she would dictate them herself. If others profited from her image, she would profit in her own right. Thus began her bold foray into producing, a decision that would bring both triumph and disaster. Few actresses of her era dared to take such control, for the risks were immense. But Gloria, accustomed to reigning, believed she could shape her own destiny as surely as she shaped her presence on screen. She invested heavily, surrounding herself with collaborators, pouring money into projects that promised glory, but often yielded little. The more she risked, the more precarious her finances became. Yet she pressed on, unwilling to surrender her independence to the cautious calculations of others. It was in this period that laughter often concealed the tremors beneath. At parties, she smiled, danced, charmed, her laughter ringing above the music as though nothing troubled her. Yet those who knew her well sensed the fragility behind it, the strain of sustaining an image while the ground beneath her grew unsteady. She had always been a woman of immense will, and her will carried her through storms that might have undone others. But even will has limits. And as the 1920s advanced, the weight upon her shoulders grew heavier. Still, the world adored her. Photographers clamored for her image, fans gathered at theaters, critics praised her performances. In the eyes of the public, she remained untouchable, the eternal diva whose life was a dream. The truth, whispered only in offices and behind closed doors, remained hidden. It is perhaps one of the cruelest paradoxes of fame, that the more fragile one becomes, the more radiant the illusion must appear. And Gloria, ever the consummate actress, knew how to keep the illusion alive. One evening, she hosted a gathering in one of her great houses. The chandeliers glowed, the tables glittered with crystal, the air was filled with music and laughter. Guests marveled at the splendor, whispering that no queen of Europe could have done better. And Gloria, radiant in her gown, presided over it all with a smile that seemed unbreakable. Yet in a quiet moment, perhaps she heard again those footsteps in the marble halls, the quiet insistence of debts drawing near. Did she shiver then, even as she smiled? Did she wonder how long she could hold the illusion? We can only imagine. Her extravagance, both shield and burden, would eventually drive her into deeper entanglements. But for now, in this chapter, she still laughed, still dazzled, still defied. She stood like a star, blazing in the night sky, even as faint cracks appeared in the heavens. And so we leave her here, in a hall filled with music and light, her laughter echoing, her jewels sparkling, even as the shadows lengthen silently at the edges. The echo of her laughter fades into silence, and in that silence we begin to hear another sound, the soft murmur of a forbidden romance, a love affair that would entwine her fate with ambition and scandal, altering her path forever. The echo of her laughter faded into silence, and from that silence there rose a murmur, softer, yet more dangerous, the murmur of a romance whispered in corners, spoken of only in guarded tones. It was not the light-hearted affection of youth, nor the fleeting flirtations of Hollywood parties, but something heavier, charged with both ambition and desire. The man was Joseph P. Kennedy, a figure whose name carried already the weight of power, whose future lineage would one day shape American history. When Gloria Swanson's path crossed his, it was as though two forces of will collided. Hers the will of beauty and command upon the screen, his the will of cunning and ambition in business and politics. What drew them together was not mere attraction, but a recognition of power mirrored in another. They met in an age of extravagance, when Hollywood was at its zenith, when wealth seemed limitless and pleasure endless. Kennedy, though married and bound by ties of family, saw in Gloria both desire and opportunity. She, radiant yet increasingly entangled in debts from her ventures, saw in him a man who might offer not only passion but salvation. Their affair, intense and clandestine, quickly became one of the most notorious liaisons of its age, though at the time its full scandal remained shrouded in whispers. Kennedy offered more than affection. He offered to manage her affairs, to rescue her from the financial tangles that threatened to undo her. He saw in Gloria not only a lover, but an investment, a figure whose fame could be harnessed, whose brilliance might be steered to greater heights. She, weary of bankers and advisers who spoke in cautious tones, found in Kennedy a man of decisive action, unafraid to risk, unafraid to seize. Together they plotted not only their romance but their ambitions, entwining love with business in ways that blurred every boundary. It was during this time that Gloria embarked on one of her boldest ventures, the production of Queen Kelly, a film that promised grandeur but delivered only ruin. Kennedy, involved in its financing, encouraged her to take risks, to embrace spectacle, to push beyond limits. The film, directed by Erich von Stroheim, became infamous for its excess, its endless delays, its spiraling costs. Scenes of opulence were staged with reckless indulgence, days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and the budget soared. Gloria, caught between her passion for art and her entanglement with Kennedy, pressed forward, believing that triumph might silence her critics and secure her fortune. But Queen Kelly collapsed beneath its own weight. The production was halted, the unfinished film left as a monument to extravagance and miscalculation. For Gloria, it was a disaster, both financial and reputational. The film that was meant to confirm her genius instead exposed her vulnerability, leaving her deeply in debt and scarred by the failure. And Kennedy, though he had invested his name and influence, quietly withdrew, leaving Gloria to bear the brunt of the ruin. Their romance, though still burning, was now entangled with betrayal, for the man who had promised salvation had instead deepened her entanglement in scandal. Still, the affair continued, fueled by passion and by the strange intoxication of two ambitious souls unable to let go. They met in secret, they spoke in whispers, they plotted dreams both personal and professional. Yet the imbalance of their bond became clear. Kennedy, always calculating, always looking to the horizon of power, remained ultimately bound to his own family, his own ambitions. Gloria, though adored and admired, was left increasingly isolated, her reputation shadowed by rumors, her finances collapsing, her heart caught in a romance that could never find resolution. The whispers spread. Hollywood, ever eager for scandal, spoke of their affair with a mix of fascination and condemnation. Friends warned Gloria of the risks, urged her to distance herself, but she was too deeply entwined, too drawn by the strange mixture of passion and strategy that Kennedy represented. For a time, she believed in the possibility that love might triumph, that together they might overcome the burdens pressing upon her. But slowly she realized that for him, she was not the center, but a chapter, one story among many in a life aimed at greater pursuits. When the end came, it was not with a storm, but with a quiet withdrawal. Kennedy stepped back, his attentions turning elsewhere, his ambitions moving forward. Gloria was left to face the ruins of Queen Kelly, the debts that mounted, the whispers that clung to her name. The romance that had once seemed a dazzling flame revealed itself as another wound, another reminder of the fragility beneath her glittering image. And yet, even in this, she found a strange strength. She did not collapse. She did not retreat. She faced the scandal, the debts, the gossip with the same poise she carried on screen. She had been betrayed, yes, but she refused to be broken. If the world saw her as a diva undone, she would transform that image into another performance, carrying herself with dignity even in defeat. Such was the paradox of Gloria Swanson, that even in her falls, she remained magnificent, her sorrow cloaked in the radiance of her bearing. Let us pause with her in a quiet moment after the collapse, the sets of Queen Kelly abandoned, the costumes hanging unused, the letters from Kennedy tucked away, unread, perhaps torn. She sits alone, her jewels still sparkling, her gown still immaculate, but her eyes carrying the weight of disappointment. Outside, the world whispers of scandal, of failure, of forbidden love. Inside, she gathers herself, steadying her heart, preparing to walk forward once more. For this is the rhythm of her life. Brilliance followed by sorrow, triumph followed by ruin, love followed by loss. And always she rises again, draped in splendor, her eyes unwavering, her spirit unbroken. The screen fades to black, and from the silence emerges a new image. Gloria, her lips moving but no sound escaping, as the world of silent cinema itself begins to crumble. The talkies are coming, and with them a new trial that will test not only her artistry, but her very identity. Her lips moved, graceful and deliberate, but no sound escaped, and in that silence a strange foreboding took shape. It was the image of an art form on the verge of vanishing, for the age of silent cinema, in which Gloria Swanson had reigned supreme, was drawing to its close. The talkies were coming, rushing in with a force that could not be resisted, promising voices where once there had only been expressions, dialogue where once eyes alone had carried meaning. For many, this was a marvel, a triumph of invention. For others, it was a death knell. And for Gloria, who had mastered the language of silence, it was both an opportunity and a trial. The late 1920s brought a fever of change. Audiences flocked to hear actors speak, to marvel at the novelty of sound. Studios rushed to adapt, to build new stages, to train performers for this strange new art. Those who had relied on expression and movement now faced the challenge of diction, of cadence, of a voice that must match the aura of their presence. For some, the transition was seamless. For others, it was ruinous, exposing accents or tones that jarred with their screen personas. Gloria, with her regal bearing and measured poise, was confronted with the question, would her voice, once unnecessary, now betray her? Her first ventures into sound were cautious. She prepared carefully, studying her voice, rehearsing her diction, determined to master this new element of performance. Her voice, clear and strong, carried with it an authority that matched her image, and in this, she was fortunate. Yet sound brought with it not only new demands, but new expectations. The elaborate melodramas of silent cinema no longer held the same spell, for audiences, now enchanted by dialogue, sought stories more natural, more immediate. Gloria, so long draped in gowns and jewels, performing as queens and empresses, now faced a public hungry for something closer to life. Her great test came with the film The Trespasser in 1929, one of her first talking pictures. She entered it with trepidation, aware that the eyes of the world were upon her, waiting to hear whether the silent goddess could speak. When her voice first filled the theater, audiences leaned forward, uncertain. What they heard was not shrill nor awkward, but steady, vibrant, confident. The critics, many of whom had expected to find weakness, instead praised her. Gloria Swanson could speak, and in speaking she preserved her place, for the moment. But the triumph was fragile. Though her voice proved capable, the very foundation of cinema had shifted. The grand spectacles that had defined her career seemed suddenly old-fashioned, relics of another age. The jazz age itself, with its glitter and excess, had begun to wane, dimmed by the gathering shadows of economic collapse. Audiences who once sought queens and divas now longed for realism, for stories of ordinary life, for voices that echoed their own. And Gloria, so long the embodiment of grandeur, struggled to find a place in this new landscape. She attempted other sound films, each with its own challenges. Some succeeded modestly, others faltered. None restored her to the unassailable throne she had once held. The critics grew harsher, the audiences less enchanted, the studio executives more doubtful. It was not that Gloria lacked talent. Her performances retained their poise, their authority. But the world around her had changed, and she, bound to an image of divine glamour, could not easily reshape herself into something more common. The pain of this decline was sharp, for she had always believed in her power to command. To see her films falter, to feel her presence questioned, was to confront the silence not of the screen, but of the world itself. She had once walked into theaters knowing that applause awaited her. Now she sometimes left them in quiet, wondering if her reign had ended. Yet even as she faltered, she did not surrender. She sought new roles, new ventures, new ways to remain. She considered the stage, she explored business, she looked for projects that might restore her brilliance. But the shadow of Queen Kelly and the scandals of her personal life lingered, and the new age of cinema moved quickly, embracing younger faces, fresher voices, stars who seemed born to the talkies rather than adapted to them. In private, the struggle weighed heavily. She had given herself fully to the screen, had lived as though it were the very essence of her being. Now, to feel it slipping away was to feel life itself diminish. Yet she endured, carrying herself with dignity even in decline. She did not collapse into bitterness, though she might have. Instead, she preserved the poise that had always defined her, insisting that even if the world no longer crowned her, its queen, she would remain regal in her own bearing. There is something haunting in this image. Gloria Swanson standing before a mirror, her gown still beautiful, her jewels still bright, her reflection still radiant, yet knowing that beyond the mirror the world has shifted. She adjusts her necklace, lifts her chin, and prepares once more to face the camera, even as doubts whisper at the edges. Her lips move again, this time with sound, and yet within her heart there lingers the silence of another age, the silence in which she had once reigned without rival. We leave her here, poised between triumph and uncertainty, her voice heard, yet her place unsettled. The lights dim on the set, the reels spin down, and her figure lingers in the half-light. Outside the studio, a train passes, its windows reflecting a solitary figure, her face glimpsed briefly before vanishing into the night. And so the story carries us onward into a time when her restless wanderings would mirror her restless heart, when marriages would falter, and loneliness would accompany her travels as faithfully as any companion. The fleeting glimpse of her face in the train window dissolved as quickly as it appeared, the glass reflecting only shadows as the carriage rolled deeper into the night. That restless image was true to her life in those years, for Gloria Swanson became a traveler not only across landscapes, but across her own unsettled emotions. The silent goddess, who had once seemed enthroned above the world, now drifted through stations, hotel lobbies, drawing rooms, marriages begun with promise and ended with silence. Each departure carried the hope of constancy, and each arrival often yielded the same pattern of loneliness repeated. Her heart, so open to passion, sought shelter in marriage again and again, as though in formal vows she might find the stability that fame and fortune had denied her. Yet for Gloria, stability proved elusive. After her divorce from Henri de la Falaise, she found herself once more alone, her image of aristocratic grandeur intact for the public, but her private life marked by absence. She entered into other unions, some brief, some longer, none enduring, each promising companionship, each collapsing under the weight of her fame, her independence, her relentless pursuit of beauty and art. The newspapers documented them with relentless precision, printing her name alongside words like divorce, separation, new love, as though her personal life were merely another serialized story for the masses. Travel became her escape, her way of filling the gaps between film projects and broken promises. She journeyed through Europe, where the remnants of old aristocracy welcomed her with fascination. She dined in Paris salons, walked among the ruins of ancient palaces in Italy, gazed upon the Rhine from train windows, sailed across the Mediterranean. In each city, she was both admired and alone, a figure who carried her own aura of majesty, yet who must return each evening to a room lit only for herself. There is something deeply haunting in the image of Gloria Swanson seated by a hotel window, the city lights flickering beyond, her gowns carefully hung in the wardrobe, her jewels resting in velvet boxes, while silence surrounds her. On the screen, her star no longer shone with the unchallenged brilliance of earlier years. The younger generation of actors and actresses were rising, their voices more natural, their presence suited to the talkies. Gloria still possessed dignity, authority, beauty, but the audience's hunger had shifted. She took roles when she could, yet she was no longer Paramount's unrivaled queen. In this space of diminished opportunity, she drifted, seeking direction, uncertain of how to reclaim her former throne. The marriages she pursued during these restless wanderings reflected this uncertainty. Each was an attempt, perhaps, to anchor herself in the midst of change, to find in another person the stability that her career no longer guaranteed. Yet each union faltered. Some husbands grew weary of her fame, of the endless scrutiny it invited. Others clashed with her independence, her insistence on living not as a wife confined, but as a woman who commanded her own destiny. The very qualities that made her extraordinary on screen, her authority, her self-possession, her refusal to bow, made her difficult to contain in private life. And Gloria, unwilling to diminish herself, chose to walk away rather than bend. It would be easy to view these repeated failures as signs of weakness, but in truth, they reveal a strength. She would not remain where her spirit was not free. She desired love, but she would not accept chains, and in this she lived with a courage that many lacked. Yet courage does not soothe loneliness, and Gloria's loneliness deepened as the years advanced. During one of her travels, she was seen seated in the corner of a train carriage, her face half hidden by a hat, her hands gloved, a book unopened on her lap. Fellow passengers recognized her, whispered her name, but did not approach. They watched her in silence, as though in awe of her presence, even in repose. Gloria, aware of their glances, maintained her poise, her eyes fixed upon the passing landscape. In that moment, she was both worshipped and untouchable, admired yet profoundly alone. Such was the paradox of her existence, to be surrounded by countless admirers and yet deprived of intimacy. And still, she searched. She painted for a time, experimented with writing, explored the quieter arts that did not demand applause. These diversions offered solace, though never permanence. They were like passing companions, keeping her company on a long journey, but never replacing the love she sought. She might have longed for a home unshaken by scandal, for affection unclouded by fame, but her path had carried her too far into myth for such simplicity to be possible. Her children, her daughter from her second marriage, and later, her adopted sons, offered a thread of constancy amid the uncertainty. She was devoted to them, protective, determined to provide stability where her own life lacked it. Yet even motherhood, though deeply cherished, could not entirely shield her from the ache of solitude. For children grow, they seek their own paths, and Gloria, though always a mother, remained also a woman, one who longed to be cherished for herself, not merely adored as an image. The restless years stretched on, carrying her further from the golden age in which she had ruled. Still she endured. Still she preserved her poise. Still she carried herself as though the crown of cinema remained upon her head. But the truth was plain. The world of Hollywood had shifted, and Gloria Swanson, though not forgotten, was no longer at its center. We leave her here, a figure glimpsed briefly in the moving window of a train, her face turned toward landscapes that passed too quickly to be held. Her life in this chapter is one of constant movement, of departures and arrivals, of marriages begun and dissolved, of journeys that end where they began, in solitude. And as the train carries her into distance, it slows at a quiet station where she will disembark, not into another marriage or another film, but into a studio of her own, a space filled not with cameras but with brushes and canvases. For the next chapter of her life will lead her into painting, writing, and the quieter search for meaning beyond the screen. The train slowed at the quiet station, its wheels grinding gently, as though reluctant to surrender her to stillness, and Gloria Swanson stepped down with her luggage into a world less public, less gilded, more inward. From the noise of travel and the turbulence of dissolving unions, she now entered a period where brushes, canvases, and the solitude of the studio offered her another stage, one without an audience. For a woman who had lived so long beneath the gaze of millions, there was something radical in turning toward arts that were seen by almost no one. Yet painting, writing, and the quieter pursuits of creativity allowed her to search for a meaning that did not depend upon applause. The studio she fashioned was unlike the grand palaces of film sets, where armies of technicians bustled and lamps burned hot against her skin. Here, light entered softly through windows, falling across empty canvases, across jars of brushes, across the folds of her clothes as she leaned to sketch or mix colors. The silence was not the same silence of the theater, punctuated by reels and murmurs, but a deeper silence, broken only by the scrape of brush against canvas or the faint sound of her own breathing. She was not performing, she was searching, translating the restless energies within her into shapes and colors that reflected moods too fragile for words. She painted landscapes sometimes, but more often she turned to abstraction, as though shapes and colors alone could carry the burdens she had long borne. Friends who saw her work spoke of boldness, of intensity, of something raw that stood in contrast to the poised figure the world believed her to be. On screen, she had been regal, untouchable. On canvas, she was experimental, vulnerable, unafraid to reveal turbulence. Perhaps painting gave her what acting never could, the freedom to create without compromise, without the demands of studios, without the judgment of critics. Alongside painting, she wrote, Her words, like her brushstrokes, revealed a woman reflecting upon herself, upon the world that had both exalted and wounded her. Some of her writings were fragments, essays never finished, letters left unsent. Others took shape more fully, expressions of philosophy, of memory, of observation. She pondered what it meant to live as an image, what it meant to be both adored and alone, what it meant to give oneself to art while longing for the ordinary tenderness of love. Her prose, measured and contemplative, was not the voice of the diva, but of the seeker. In these quieter years, she also turned toward causes that reflected her sense of independence. She spoke of health, of nutrition, of living with discipline even amid indulgence. She advocated practices that seemed unusual at the time: whole foods, natural diets, regimens of care that decades later would become common, but in her day marked her as eccentric. Yet this, too, was part of Gloria Swanson's nature: to stand apart, to live differently, to shape herself not only for the screen, but for her own sense of truth. It would be misleading to suggest that these years were serene. They were not without restlessness, not without longing. The echoes of her past remained near. The debts, the scandals, the memories of lovers, the faint ache of diminished fame. At times she returned to Hollywood, attempted projects, sought ways to reclaim the screen. But often these efforts faltered, for the world had shifted and no longer wished to crown her as it once had. Each failure brought disappointment, and yet she did not collapse into bitterness. She carried herself with dignity, refusing to allow the fading of one chapter to diminish her worth. Her painting and writing became, in a sense, her companions. They could not offer applause, but they also could not betray. They did not demand that she wear jewels or gowns, nor did they whisper of scandal. They simply absorbed what she gave them, returning to her the quiet satisfaction of creation. It is possible to imagine her in the late afternoon, the light dimming, her brush set aside, her hands speckled with paint, as she leaned back and regarded her canvas with a calm smile. No audience, no photographers, no critics, only herself and the work of her own hands. And yet she remained Gloria Swanson, and the world could never fully forget her. Even as her career waned, her name retained its resonance. Journalists sought her for interviews, eager to ask about the silent era, about DeMille, about Kennedy, about the films that had defined a generation. She answered with poise, offering glimpses of her past, but rarely surrendering her full truth. For though she turned inward in her art, she never ceased to protect the aura of mystery that had always been part of her legend. There is a kind of nobility in her endurance. Many stars of the silent era vanished entirely, consumed by despair or obscurity. Gloria endured, not always triumphant, but steadfast. She redefined herself, sought new forms of expression, preserved her dignity, even as the world changed around her. In her, one senses a spirit that refused to yield, even when fortune and fame had turned their backs. In this chapter of her life, she is less the diva commanding a stage than the woman seated quietly in a studio, her hands stained with paint, her notebooks filled with words, her mind searching for meaning in silence. It is a gentler image, but no less compelling, for it reveals the depth behind the glamour, the humanity behind the myth. Let us linger with her here, in that quiet room where the canvas stands unfinished, where the brush rests beside a jar of water, where the evening light turns golden before fading into shadow. The silence is profound, but it is not empty. It is the silence of a woman who, for the first time in many years, is alone with herself, neither adored nor judged, but simply creating. And from this silence we shall step into another, the silence not chosen, but imposed, the silence of obscurity, when even the memory of her name seemed to fade from the world stage, leaving her to wonder if she had been forgotten entirely. The silence of the studio, with its brushes and half-finished canvases, slowly gave way to a heavier silence, one that was not chosen, but imposed. It was the silence of exile from Hollywood, the silence of a world that once clamored for her presence and now seemed to forget she had ever reigned. For Gloria Swanson, who had known the roar of applause and the flash of adoration, this new quiet was both unbearable and strangely instructive. To walk through streets without recognition, to see theaters filled with films that bore no trace of her image, to hear younger names spoken where once hers had been untouchable. This was exile in its most intimate form. She had not disappeared entirely, of course. Her name still carried resonance, her past still invited whispers. But she was no longer at the center, no longer the axis around which the glamour of cinema revolved. The great studios that had once vied for her attention now turned to other stars, women who were younger, whose voices and faces suited the new era. Hollywood was merciless in its cycles of creation and forgetting. It crowned queens and it dethroned them, sometimes within the same breath. Gloria, who had once been the very embodiment of divine glamour, now found herself drifting at the edges of the empire she had helped build. There were years in which she did not appear on screen at all, years in which the silence of absence grew thicker. She filled her days with travels, with painting, with writing, with pursuits that gave her solace, but not the public affirmation she had long been accustomed to. The invitations grew fewer, the headlines less frequent. She became, for many, a memory rather than a presence, a relic of a bygone age when actresses spoke with their eyes and commanded empires with a glance. For some, obscurity is a refuge, a place where one can live quietly, unbothered by the relentless scrutiny of fame. For Gloria, it was more complex. She valued her independence, cherished her art, and lived with dignity. Yet she also felt the ache of absence, the wound of being forgotten. To be admired by strangers is not the same as being loved by friends, but to have neither is a profound loneliness. Gloria's solitude deepened in these years, even as she maintained her poise. She never descended into public despair, never allowed bitterness to shape her outward self, but inside, the silence weighed upon her, and still, she endured. She gave interviews when asked, appearing occasionally on stage or in public events, always immaculate, always commanding. People who encountered her in those years spoke of her dignity, her refusal to appear diminished. She did not weep for her lost throne. She carried herself as though she had never lost it. Yet there is poignancy in that bearing, for to hold one's head high in exile is to acknowledge, silently, that exile has come. Sometimes she was invited to retrospectives, to gatherings that celebrated the silent era. Younger audiences curious about the past saw her films with fresh eyes, marveling at the power of her gaze, the precision of her movement, the intensity of her screen presence. In such moments, Gloria felt a brief restoration, a reminder that her art had not vanished entirely. But these were fleeting consolations, brief flashes of memory in a world that was moving swiftly toward new idols. In her private reflections, she wondered at the nature of fame itself, how quickly it came, how fiercely it burned, and how suddenly it departed. She had given her life to the screen, had sacrificed love, had risked fortune, had endured scandal, all for an immortality that now seemed fragile. What was fame? She asked herself. But a trick of light, a reflection on a screen that faded when the reel ended. Was she remembered for herself, or only for the illusions she had created? These questions lingered, unanswerable, yet haunting. There were evenings when she sat alone in her home, the lamps dimmed, her jewels locked away, her gowns folded in cedar chests. The echoes of laughter and applause seemed impossibly distant, as though they had belonged to another lifetime. She would look into mirrors, her face older now, lines etched gently by time, and she would wonder if the world still saw in her the goddess it once had. And then, gathering her dignity, she would lift her chin, for she knew that even if the world forgot, She herself would not surrender her radiance. This exile, though painful, prepared her in ways she could not yet know. For beyond the years of obscurity, beyond the silence that seemed to entomb her, there awaited a resurrection, one of the strangest and most powerful in cinema's history. But that lay still in the distance. For now she endured the obscurity with dignity, filling her days with quiet pursuits, carrying herself with the assurance of a queen in exile, awaiting whatever fate might yet unfold. Let us imagine her here, seated in a quiet projection room, a reel of her old films flickering upon the screen. Dust gathers on the reels, the images stutter faintly. Yet when her face appears, luminous and commanding, she cannot help but smile. For even if the world forgets, the image endures, and in that endurance a piece of her remains immortal. She sits alone, watching herself as others once watched her, a spectator of her own myth, caught between memory and longing. As the reel ends and the lights fade, the silence deepens once more, and we step into the years when she would occasionally venture back into the light, making appearances, taking small roles, hovering between memory and relevance. A letter arrives then, a letter unlike others, a letter from Billy Wilder offering her not obscurity, not a small part, but a role that would transform her exile into eerie immortality. A letter lay upon the table, its paper crisp, its words deliberate, and unlike the countless notes and requests that had crossed her path in the years of exile, this one bore the name of Billy Wilder. It was not a casual invitation to appear in a retrospective, nor a request for a fleeting cameo to remind audiences of a bygone queen. It was an offer of a role that seemed both uncanny and inevitable, for in it Gloria Swanson would not merely act. She would mirror herself, reflect her own exile, embody her own myth. The role was Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, a fading, silent star haunting a mansion of shadows, clinging to the memory of applause that had long since faded. For Gloria, the script must have seemed like a cruel trick of fate, or perhaps a gift designed precisely for her. One final chance to step once more into the light. She hesitated. To accept was to expose herself, to risk being swallowed by a caricature of her own life. Was she to become, in the public's eye, the very image of the faded diva, trapped in nostalgia, mad with memory? Or was she to reclaim her throne by transforming tragedy into art, to show that even in decline, she commanded the screen as no one else could? The decision was not easy, for pride still burned fiercely within her, and pride recoiled from the thought of playing a woman ridiculed by time. Yet beneath pride lay hunger, the hunger to act again, to feel the heat of the lamps, to gaze into the camera and command attention. She read the script again and again. Norma Desmond spoke words that cut deeply, words of a star abandoned, a queen dethroned, a goddess reduced to memory. Lines that seemed written, not only for the character, but for Gloria herself. The role demanded that she confront her own wounds, that she reveal the scars of her exile, that she perform not merely as an actress, but as a woman stripped bare before the world. To accept was to risk her dignity, but to decline was to fade entirely into silence. At last she agreed, and with that agreement her exile cracked open, and the light of the screen beckoned her once more. The filming of Sunset Boulevard was itself a strange pilgrimage, for the sets echoed the very atmosphere of her life, a great mansion shrouded in gloom, filled with relics of past grandeur, a silent queen wandering its halls. When Gloria stepped onto the set, dressed in Norma's gowns, adorned in costumes that blurred the line between character and self, those who watched felt chills. It was as though the silent goddess had returned, not as she once was, but as she had become. Proud, wounded, magnificent, tragic. Her gestures, her expressions, her voice, all carried the weight of lived experience. She did not merely act Norma Desmond, she inhabited her. In one scene, she declared, "We didn't need dialogue, we had faces." The line, delivered with steely conviction, rang as both truth and lament, echoing Gloria's own reign in the silent age. Audiences, when they later heard it, felt the ghost of that era stir within them. The performance was uncanny not because it was imitation, but because it was revelation. Gloria gave herself to Norma, and Norma gave herself back to Gloria, a haunting exchange between fiction and reality. Billy Wilder, with his sharp vision, guided her gently, respecting her dignity, even as he asked her to expose her wounds. He understood that Gloria Swanson was not merely an actress playing a role, but an emblem of cinema itself, carrying within her both its glory and its decay. Her co-stars watched with reverence, for they knew they were witnessing not simply a performance, but a resurrection. The months of filming were both exhilarating and exhausting. Gloria, long absent from the intensity of major productions, found herself once more at the center, surrounded by cameras, attended by crews, her every gesture scrutinized. Yet she rose to the challenge with astonishing vigor, proving that her talent had not faded, that her command remained. She delivered lines with precision, moved with the elegance of memory, inhabited silence with the mastery of her past. Those on set whispered that it was as though the silent queen had returned, not to reclaim her old throne, but to build a new one from the ruins. When the film was completed and released in 1950, the world gasped. Sunset Boulevard was not merely a movie, it was an event, a confrontation with Hollywood's own past. Critics hailed her performance as extraordinary, eerie, unforgettable. Audiences, many of whom had long forgotten her, now saw her anew, both as the diva they once adored and as the tragic figure embodying their nostalgia. Gloria Swanson, the Queen of Silence, had returned through sound, and in her return, she delivered one of the most haunting performances in cinema's history. Yet the triumph was bittersweet. For though she was praised, though her name once again adorned headlines, the role bound her forever to Norma Desmond. The line between Gloria and Norma blurred, and many could not separate the woman from the character. She had returned to the spotlight, but the spotlight illuminated her wounds as much as her brilliance. To be remembered as Norma was to be remembered as a woman undone by time, and Gloria, proud as ever, struggled with this legacy. Still, she accepted it with dignity, knowing that immortality, even tragic, was better than silence. Let us leave her in that final scene, standing at the top of the staircase, eyes blazing, voice trembling with both madness and majesty, declaring herself ready for her close-up. The cameras roll, the lights burn. The world watches as Gloria Swanson becomes both herself and not herself, both the eternal diva and the tragic phantom of cinema's past. And from the glow of that close-up, as the screen fades to black, another sound emerges, the thunder of applause, triumphant and mournful at once, dissolving slowly into silence again. It is into this silence that we must now follow her, into the later years when the world, having remembered her briefly, allowed her once more to slip into shadows, her triumph tempered by the melancholy of passing time. The applause thundered and then slowly faded, dissolving into a hush. Yet the glow of that close-up lingered, etched upon the collective memory of all who saw it. Gloria Swanson, standing at the summit of the staircase, her eyes aflame with triumph and madness, had not merely acted. She had conjured something spectral. In Sunset Boulevard, the film and her life folded into each other like overlapping mirrors, each reflecting the other until the line between truth and illusion dissolved. Those who watched her saw not only Norma Desmond, the phantom star of a silent age, but also Gloria herself, the woman who had once ruled the screen, then wandered in exile, and now returned in a performance that felt less like artifice and more like revelation. Filming the picture was, for her, a strange haunting. Each day she walked into Paramount Studios, the very place where she had once reigned, and now found herself playing a ghost within its gates. The sets, drenched in shadow, captured the decay of grandeur. A mansion suffocated by velvet drapes, rooms filled with relics of a past that refused to die. In these spaces she moved not as an actress wearing a costume, but as a woman revisiting the remnants of her own former glory. There were moments when crew members stood in silence, watching her, chilled by the uncanny sense that Gloria Swanson had become a vessel through which the history of cinema itself spoke. Billy Wilder, sharp and unflinching, directed her with precision. He understood the delicate balance. Norma must be grotesque, yet dignified, pitiable, yet terrifying. Gloria, with her own reserves of pride and poise, infused the character with a dignity that prevented mockery. She gave Norma grandeur even in madness, refusing to let her become a mere caricature of decline. Those who knew Gloria personally remarked that it was her pride, unyielding, imperious, that made the role so powerful. In surrendering to the character, she simultaneously resisted it, ensuring that Norma's tragedy never entirely overwhelmed Gloria's radiance. Certain lines struck her with uncanny force. "I am big. It's the pictures that got small." In that declaration, audiences heard Norma, but they also heard Gloria, the silent star whose fame had once stretched across the world, now speaking across decades. In another moment, she gazed upon reels of her old films within the story itself, the images flickering upon the screen. What the audience did not know was that these were indeed Gloria's own silent films, pulled from archives and projected once more. There, within the fiction, she watched herself as she once had been, luminous in youth, commanding without voice. It was a moment of eerie doubling, Gloria playing Norma, watching Gloria. Art and life spiraled together, inseparable. The younger actors who worked alongside her, William Holden and others, were struck by her intensity. Holden, cast as the drifting screenwriter ensnared in Norma's world, often remarked on her discipline, her ability to summon emotion with precision, her refusal to treat the role as mere performance. For Gloria, this was not only a film, it was a reckoning. Every gesture carried the weight of her own past. Every line reverberated with memory. The set was heavy with this knowledge, and even the crew, hardened by routine, felt the strangeness of what they were witnessing. There were days when Gloria herself felt unsettled. Playing Norma was like conversing with a shadow, like staring into a distorted reflection of her own soul. She admitted later that the role haunted her, that it required her to open wounds she had long kept hidden. Yet she embraced the pain, for she understood that only by surrendering to it could she give the performance its truth. She became both priestess and sacrifice, offering herself to the camera in a ritual of remembrance. When filming concluded, she felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that the haunting was over, sorrow that the intense communion with her art had ended. She knew, even before the film was released, that it would mark her forever, that Norma Desmond would become inseparable from her name. Whether this was a blessing or a curse, she could not yet say. Upon release, the world responded with awe. Critics hailed the film as a masterpiece, Wilder's vision as unflinching, Holden's performance as sharp, but it was Gloria who carried the crown. Her Norma Desmond became a symbol not only of faded stardom, but of the very passage of time, of the fragility of fame, of the haunting power of cinema itself. Awards and honors followed, though she was denied the Oscar that many believed she deserved. Yet the recognition mattered less than the fact that her name, once fading, now burned brightly once more. Still, the triumph was edged with melancholy, for the role that restored her also defined her. Many could no longer see Gloria without seeing Norma. Journalists wrote of the eerie similarities. Critics marveled at the blurring of lines. Gloria herself, though proud of her work, bristled at being reduced to a tragic relic. She reminded those who asked that she was not Norma Desmond, that she had endured, adapted, lived with dignity. Yet the shadow of Norma lingered, and she could never entirely escape it. Let us linger with her in that final scene, replayed endlessly in theaters. Gloria descending into madness, stepping toward the camera with blazing eyes, whispering, "All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up." The line, immortalized, became more than cinema. It became myth, a phrase that still echoes through time whenever the fragility of fame is recalled. In that moment, she was both Gloria and Norma, both diva and ghost, both triumphant and tragic. As the reels ended and audiences departed the theaters, the applause that had once been only memory rose again. Yet applause, like all things, fades, and once more she found herself in the silence that follows triumph. For even the greatest resurrection cannot hold forever, and the years after Sunset Boulevard brought new challenges. Television appearances, stage roles, smaller ventures, each a reminder that her moment of immortal brilliance had not restored her to a throne, but had given her instead a place in legend. And so we leave her here, at the height of her haunting triumph, standing in the glow of applause that is both real and ghostly, both present and fading. The sound lingers, then dissolves into silence again, and in that silence a single candle flickers in the darkness, burning stubbornly even as the room grows dim. The candle flickered in the darkened room, its flame wavering as though uncertain whether to endure or to surrender to the surrounding gloom. And in that fragile light, we may see Gloria Swanson in the days that followed the release of Sunset Boulevard. The world that had once forgotten her now remembered. The audiences who had grown accustomed to new stars now spoke her name again, and the critics, often merciless in their judgments, bowed before her with praise that was both admiring and tinged with unease. For they knew, as all who watched the film knew, that what they had seen was not merely performance, but confession, not only art, but the revelation of a life. The reception of the film was immediate and overwhelming. Reviewers called it haunting, a masterpiece of disillusion, a mirror held up to Hollywood itself. Gloria's portrayal of Norma Desmond was singled out as extraordinary, a work of art that transcended acting and entered the realm of myth. Audiences were stunned, moved, unsettled. Many wept, though they could not say if they wept for Norma or for Gloria, for the lines between them were too blurred to untangle. For weeks and months, her face once more adorned newspapers and magazines, her interviews sought by journalists eager to ask how it felt to embody such a character. She answered with dignity, reminding them gently that Norma was not Gloria, that she was not the woman who lived in the shadows of memory, but one who had endured, who had lived with strength, who still possessed vitality. And yet, no matter how often she insisted upon this difference, the public continued to fuse the two. To them, Gloria Swanson was Norma Desmond, and Norma Desmond was Gloria Swanson. It was a marriage of identities that could not be undone. Awards followed, though the greatest prize eluded her. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress, and many believed she deserved to win. Yet the statue went to another, and Gloria, though outwardly gracious, could not entirely conceal her disappointment. For all her pride in her performance, for all the recognition it brought, there lingered the sting of being honored but not crowned. Some whispered that Hollywood, though dazzled by her resurrection, still feared her, still resented the mirror she had held to its face. Others believed it was simply fate, another twist in a life defined by brilliance edged with loss. Still, the triumph was undeniable. Invitations came for appearances, for interviews, for projects. She was celebrated at gatherings, spoken of as though she had never vanished. Younger audiences who had never known her reign in the silent age now discovered her with awe, marveling that such a figure had once commanded the screen in silence and now returned in sound with such force. For a moment, it seemed as though Gloria Swanson had reclaimed her place, not as the eternal queen of Paramount, but as the eternal symbol of cinema itself. And yet, beneath the admiration lay melancholy. For what does it mean to be remembered for a role that is also a wound? To have one's immortality bound to the image of decline? Gloria accepted the acclaim with poise, but privately she wrestled with this paradox. She was grateful, proud, vindicated, yet she also knew that the world would now see her forever through the shadow of Norma Desmond. Her brilliance had returned her to immortality, but it had done so by binding her to tragedy. There were evenings in those years when she attended gala screenings, where applause rose thunderous as she entered, dressed immaculately, her head held high. Cameras flashed, voices cried her name, admirers pressed forward. And then, as she sat in the darkness of the theater, watching herself flicker across the screen, she felt the weight of recognition that was both blessing and curse. For in Norma's haunted eyes she saw her own past reflected, and in the audience's gasps she heard both admiration and pity. Still, Gloria never surrendered her pride. She refused to allow herself to be diminished, to become the caricature the public imagined. She spoke firmly of her independence, of her resilience, of her ability to endure. In interviews she laughed, she charmed, she insisted upon her vitality. She reminded the world that she was not only a relic of silence, not only a ghost of Hollywood's past, but a woman of the present, capable, strong, unbroken. And in this refusal she preserved her dignity even against the shadow of Norma. But triumph cannot last forever. As the years passed, the fervor of Sunset Boulevard slowly quieted. New films arose, new stars claimed the public's attention. Gloria, though still admired, was once again left at the edges. She made appearances on television, took roles on stage, experimented with ventures that allowed her to remain visible. Yet the great roles of cinema no longer came. Hollywood had embraced her briefly, celebrated her resurrection, and then, as always, turned to fresher faces. And so the candle that had burned so brightly during the release of Sunset Boulevard began once more to flicker, its light steady, yet fragile. Gloria Swanson, the eternal diva, was remembered, but remembrance is not the same as presence. She remained dignified, radiant, commanding in her own sphere, yet the world around her shifted again, leaving her to navigate the quieter paths of later life. Let us leave her here, seated after a gala, the applause still echoing faintly in her ears, her gown shimmering in the fading light, her jewels catching the last glint of the chandeliers. Around her, the hall grows quiet, the voices fade, and she sits in solitude, a candle still burning though the room is dark. And from that flickering flame we shall move into the next chapter, when the candle's stubborn light illuminates her later years, her ventures into television, theater, and public life, her refusal to vanish entirely, her determination to remain visible even as time drew its veil across her. The candle still burned in the darkness, its stubborn flame refusing to surrender, and in that fragile light we may glimpse Gloria Swanson in the later years of her life. When time had moved inexorably forward, yet she, with her customary pride, would not allow herself to fade into complete obscurity. For though the triumph of Sunset Boulevard had passed, and though Hollywood had once again turned its gaze toward newer faces, Gloria retained within her a fierce determination. She had always refused to be forgotten, and now, even as the years gathered upon her, she sought out new stages upon which to stand. Not always the gilded palaces of Paramount, but platforms nonetheless that allowed her flame to be seen. Television became one such stage. In the decades after Sunset Boulevard, the glowing box that filled homes across America offered Gloria the chance to remain present in the public mind. She appeared on talk shows, game shows, and variety programs, bringing with her the same composure that had carried her through the silent age. Audiences, both those who remembered her reign and those who knew her only through Norma Desmond, were captivated by her poise. She did not treat these appearances lightly, as some stars of her generation did, but as opportunities to remind the world that she was still vital, still elegant, still capable of commanding attention. When she entered a studio, even for a brief interview, she carried herself as though walking onto a set designed solely for her. Theater, too, beckoned, and Gloria, ever restless, embraced the challenge. She took to the stage with vigor, proving that she was not confined to the flicker of film. On stage, her presence was undeniable, her gestures as precise and commanding as they had been in her silent days, her voice carrying strength and resonance. Critics often remarked upon her discipline, her refusal to coast on reputation. Even in her later years, she rehearsed diligently, demanded excellence from herself, and sought to give her audience more than nostalgia. She wanted to be seen not only as the ghost of silent cinema, but as an artist who endured. These appearances brought her satisfaction, yet they also carried with them a trace of melancholy. For no matter how brightly she shone in a theater or on a television screen, the memory of what she had once been, the undisputed queen of cinema, lingered like a shadow. She was visible, yes, but never again in the way she had been. And perhaps, in her most private moments, she wondered if these smaller stages were merely candles lit against the encroaching dark, insufficient to match the brilliance she had once commanded. Yet she accepted them with grace, refusing to collapse into bitterness, choosing instead to walk with dignity upon whatever stage remained open to her. Her personal philosophy in these years became one of resilience and reinvention. She spoke often of health, of vitality, of living deliberately. Long before such concerns became fashionable, Gloria advocated natural diets, whole foods, and practices of self-care that seemed eccentric to many at the time. She declared that discipline of the body and mind was essential, and she lived accordingly, careful in her habits, committed to preserving her strength. It was as though she sought to master time itself, to prove that aging need not mean surrender. And in truth, she succeeded more than most, for even in her 70s she retained a striking presence, her bearing as upright, her eyes as sharp, her style as meticulous as ever. Publicly, she was often celebrated as a survivor, a relic who refused to vanish. She accepted honors, attended retrospectives, and graciously accepted the admiration of younger generations who discovered her through Sunset Boulevard and the rediscovered silent films. She moved among them as though time had not touched her, regal, amused, patient. And yet behind the elegance, there remained the solitude that had followed her all her life. For while she had many admirers, many friends, and many companions in passing, true constancy had always eluded her. The marriages of her later life, like those of her earlier years, brought companionship but rarely permanence. She longed always for the simple tenderness of love without condition. But it seemed that for Gloria Swanson, love was forever entangled with the burdens of her fame, her pride, her independence. And so she lived often alone, yet never defeated, carrying her solitude with the same dignity she carried her jewels. She continued to appear in public, her style never diminished. Even in advanced age, she dressed with elegance, her gowns tailored, her jewels carefully chosen, her hair immaculate. She did not surrender to the quiet anonymity that many accept in later years. To the very end, she insisted upon being Gloria Swanson, the eternal diva, the woman who had once embodied Hollywood's golden dream. Those who saw her in her later decades spoke of her as a figure out of time, a relic of another age, yet still alive with energy, still proud, still unyielding. There is a kind of nobility in this refusal to fade. Many of her contemporaries succumbed to despair, to bitterness, to retreat. Gloria endured. She transformed herself again and again, from silent star to sound actress, from producer to painter, from exile to legend, from relic to survivor. The stages may have grown smaller, but the flame remained. Let us linger with her in one of these later appearances, perhaps on a television stage where she sits beneath bright lights, her gown elegant, her jewels gleaming, her posture regal. The host asks her about the silent era, about Sunset Boulevard, about what it was like to reign as a queen of the screen. She answers with wit, with composure, with the faintest smile. The audience applauds, charmed and humbled by her presence. And as she rises to leave, the lights catch her face, still luminous, still commanding, as though time itself has been briefly suspended. But when the lights dim and the studio empties, she returns again to her private spaces, where silence greets her, and the ticking of a clock measures the hours with quiet inevitability. And it is with the sound of that clock, steady and unrelenting, that we must step into the next chapter of her story, when reflections upon aging, beauty, and survival would weigh heavily upon her, and wisdom, fragile yet proud, would emerge from the solitude. The clock ticked steadily in the quiet house, its sound soft yet insistent, marking out the hours with a patience that no will could command. And in that rhythm, Gloria Swanson began to measure her days. She had lived through the tumult of silent cinema, the blaze of the jazz age, the bitter shadows of scandal, the humiliation of financial ruin, the resurrection of Sunset Boulevard. Now, in the stillness of later years, she turned inward, reflecting upon the passage of time, upon beauty and survival, upon what it meant to endure when so many of her contemporaries had vanished. The mirror that had once been her confidant now became her questioner, showing her both the luminous goddess she had been and the woman she had become, marked gently by age, yet still radiant with presence. She was proud of her survival, and rightly so. Many who had shared her ascent in the silent years had long since disappeared, their names remembered only by scholars and cinephiles, their faces preserved on brittle reels that gathered dust in archives. Gloria, by contrast, still stood in the world, her name still spoken, her presence still felt. She knew this was not by accident but by will, for she had refused despair, had refused to collapse into anonymity, had refused to surrender to bitterness. She had shaped herself again and again into a figure who endured. Yet endurance came at a cost, and she often pondered whether the strength that had preserved her also barred her from the tenderness she had longed for. Beauty had been both her crown and her burden. From her earliest days with DeMille, through the extravagance of the jazz age, through her triumph in Sunset Boulevard, she had been worshipped for her appearance, her poise, her elegance. She had cultivated her image with precision, choosing gowns, jewels, gestures with care. But now, as she aged, she wondered, had beauty concealed her true self? Had the world ever seen her beyond the jewels and the silks? Did anyone know Gloria beneath the myth? These questions haunted her, not with bitterness, but with a gentle melancholy, as though she herself was uncertain of where the woman ended and the diva began. Yet she did not reject her beauty, nor did she deny its power. Instead, she sought to redefine it. She spoke openly in interviews about the dignity of aging, about the possibility of remaining vibrant even as years gathered. She urged women not to surrender themselves to despair when youth faded, but to cultivate style, health, and confidence at every stage of life. She became an advocate of wellness, speaking of diets, of natural foods, of practices that sustained the body and the spirit. To many she seemed eccentric, a star of another era preaching strange regimens. But in time, as the world grew more attentive to health and longevity, her words were seen as prophetic. There was in her reflections a note of defiance. She would not allow time to dictate her worth. She would not bow to the narrative that aging diminished a woman. She carried herself with the same upright poise she always had, her clothes still chosen with care, her hair still styled, her jewels still worn with dignity. Even in her 70s and 80s, she remained immaculate, determined to prove that survival could itself be a form of beauty. Her presence at public events was not that of a frail relic, but of a woman who still commanded respect, who still embodied glamour, even if the world around her had changed beyond recognition. Yet beneath this poise lay vulnerability, and Gloria did not entirely conceal it. She spoke at times of loneliness, of the ache of being remembered more as a symbol than as a person. She confessed her longing for affection, for companionship, for the simple comforts that grandeur had never given her. In her private hours, she reflected on her failed marriages, her restless affairs, her endless search for a love that might endure. Was it her fame that made such love impossible, or her pride, or merely fate? She did not pretend to know, but she carried the sorrow of it within her even as she smiled for cameras and spoke brightly to interviewers. Friends who visited her in these years often remarked upon her resilience. She lived with discipline, rising early, eating carefully, keeping her routines. She filled her days with writing, with correspondence, with appearances, with the small rituals that gave structure to solitude. She remained curious, engaged, thoughtful, never collapsing into inertia. Yet in the evenings, when the house grew quiet and the clock ticked softly, she sometimes sat alone in her parlor, gazing at photographs of her younger self, her films flickering faintly in memory. She was proud of her survival, yet she was also haunted by the question that lingers for all who have been adored. Had she been loved, truly loved for herself, or only for the image she projected? This mixture of pride and sorrow gave her later reflections a fragile wisdom. She spoke not as one who had conquered life, nor as one defeated by it, but as one who had endured its paradoxes. She knew that brilliance often demands sacrifice, that glory is often twinned with tragedy, that beauty enchants, but also imprisons. She accepted these truths without bitterness, though not without pain, and in her acceptance lay a dignity that few achieve. Let us linger with her here, in a quiet room, the clock ticking, the photographs of her past laid upon a table, the candlelight flickering gently against her face. She sits upright, her posture as regal as ever, her eyes contemplative. She is not Norma Desmond, lost in madness, nor is she the silent goddess of her youth. She is Gloria Swanson, survivor, thinker, woman, still luminous in her own way, still unbroken. And as the clock ticks on, we must move with her into the final years, when even wisdom and resilience could not shield her from the solitude of aging, when love affairs waned and reinventions grew fewer, and she was left with fading photographs held in trembling hands. The photographs lay upon the table, their edges worn, their images fading, and in her trembling hands, Gloria Swanson held them as one might hold a relic, fragile yet luminous with memory. Each photograph was a door to another time. Herself as a young girl in Chicago, draped in innocence, herself radiant in DeMille's gowns, pearls cascading from her shoulders, herself arm in arm with lovers whose names were now spoken only in whispers. They were not merely pictures, but fragments of her soul, reminders of a life that had burned brightly, sometimes too brightly, leaving behind ashes and brilliance alike. In these final decades, she turned often to such images, not in despair, but in contemplation, asking softly what it all had meant. Her heart, though weathered by disappointment, still longed for affection. Even in later years, she sought love, as though refusing to surrender the possibility that tenderness might arrive even at life's twilight. There were companions, suitors, admirers who circled her still, drawn not only by her fame, but by the dignity with which she carried herself. For Gloria Swanson never diminished, never allowed herself to appear pitiable. She remained elegant, proud, commanding, and this magnetism ensured she was never entirely without company. Yet love, in its truest sense, continued to elude her. She had been a goddess to so many, but rarely a simple woman to one. The marriages of her earlier life had left scars too deep to be erased, and though she embraced companionship, she often found herself once more alone when the lights dimmed. Still, she reinvented herself, even in these years, as though refusing to accept that the story had ended. She turned again to writing, producing memoirs that recounted her life with clarity and restraint. In them, she defended herself against gossip, clarified myths, and offered glimpses of the woman behind the jewels. Readers were fascinated, for she did not write as Norma Desmond might have, trapped in delusion, but as Gloria Swanson, reflective and proud, willing to acknowledge sorrow but unwilling to yield to it. Her words revealed intelligence, wit, and the same discipline that had carried her through decades of reinvention. She also lent her name to causes, to appearances, to ventures that allowed her to remain visible. She championed health and natural living long before such ideas became common. She spoke of diet, of restraint, of care for the body as a temple. Some dismissed her as eccentric, others admired her foresight, but Gloria cared little for consensus. She lived as she believed, unafraid of ridicule, and in this stubbornness lay the core of her survival. There were evenings when she attended dinners or gatherings, her gown still elegant, her hair immaculate, her jewels chosen with care. Younger generations marveled at her, not always for her past glories, but for the fact that she still carried herself with such majesty. She did not retreat into anonymity, nor did she disguise her age. Instead, she wore it as another form of adornment, proof that beauty could endure beyond youth, that radiance could coexist with fragility. To see her enter a room in her 80s was to witness the persistence of a spirit that had never bent. And yet solitude lingered. In her private hours, the photographs returned to her hands, the silence of her rooms wrapped around her, the memories of lovers and husbands and admirers whispering faintly in the shadows. She was not broken, but she was alone, and that aloneness weighed heavily. She had conquered the screen, she had survived scandal, she had outlived her era, but she had never found the lasting tenderness she had sought. Her triumphs were undeniable, but her heart bore the cost. She often spoke in these years of survival, of the need to endure, of the discipline that had allowed her to remain herself when others had vanished. But when her words softened, when she allowed the mask of the diva to fall, one could hear the longing beneath. She wanted not only to be remembered, not only to be admired, but to be cherished, to be seen not as a goddess or a legend, but as Gloria, a woman of flesh and longing. Let us pause with her here, in one of her final reinventions, seated at a desk, pen in hand, writing the story of her life. The lamp casts a warm glow, the paper fills with words, her script firm and steady. She pauses to sip tea, glances at a photograph of her younger self, and then writes again, determined that her story will not be told only by others, not shaped solely by gossip or myth, but by her own hand. In this, she claims authority once more, shaping her legacy as she had once shaped her performances. Outside, the world moved on. New stars were born, new films dazzled audiences, new scandals occupied the press. But within her home, Gloria Swanson endured, her presence still commanding, her mind still sharp, her spirit still radiant. She had loved, she had lost, she had created, she had suffered. And now, as her years grew fewer, she prepared herself with the same poise with which she had always lived. The photographs, fading though they were, remained in her hands. Their images flickered in her eyes as though the projector of memory played upon her heart. And as she held them, she seemed to whisper a farewell, not only to the lovers and roles they depicted, but to herself as she had once been. And from that image, Gloria Swanson in her later years, photographs trembling in her hands, we are led gently onward toward the inevitable curtain. For soon the flame would dim, and the applause would fall silent, and the world would awaken to the news of her passing. Her name once more upon the lips of millions, her story sealed. The photographs trembled in her hands, their faces fading into shadow, and soon even the photographs were set aside as the final curtain of life drew near. In the spring of 1983, in New York City, Gloria Swanson departed this world, leaving behind not only the memories of her films, but the aura of a life lived as though it were itself a performance. She was 84 years old, and when the news of her death spread, the world paused for a moment, recalling a name that had once been synonymous with divine glamour, with scandal and survival, with Hollywood itself. The obituaries came swiftly, filling newspapers across continents. Some spoke of her as the reigning goddess of silent cinema, the empress draped in pearls and silks under DeMille's lights. Others remembered her for Sunset Boulevard, that haunting resurrection, where she embodied the fading of an entire era. Many spoke of her scandals, her loves, her marriages, her bankruptcies, her eccentricities, for she had lived too large to be remembered in simple terms. She was celebrated and dissected, revered and questioned, honored and mourned. Yet beneath all the words lay the recognition that Gloria Swanson had been more than an actress. She had been an emblem of the strange power of fame, its ecstasy, and its ruin. For those who had loved her in the 1920s, her passing felt like the closing of a chapter long since dimmed but never forgotten. They remembered the thrill of seeing her glide across the screen in gowns that shimmered, in jewels that glittered, her eyes commanding all they gazed upon. They remembered a world of silent faces, of orchestras playing in darkened theaters, of evenings when cinema itself seemed a miracle. To them, Gloria was the embodiment of that miracle, and her death reopened memories buried beneath the dust of decades. For younger generations, who had known her chiefly through Norma Desmond, her passing was tinged with irony. They remembered her blazing eyes on the staircase, her declaration of readiness for her close-up, her chilling embodiment of fading glory. To them, she was not only Gloria Swanson, but also the eternal Norma, the ghost of cinema staring back at them across the abyss of time. And so her death was felt not only as the loss of a woman, but as the loss of a symbol, the closing of a door between Hollywood's present and its haunting past. The funeral was attended by friends, admirers, and colleagues, though many of those who had once shared her reign were themselves long gone. There was dignity in the farewell, a quiet recognition that she had lived a life both brilliant and tragic, that she had carried herself with pride even in decline. Flowers were laid, prayers spoken, her name intoned once more with reverence. And as her body was laid to rest, the city outside carried on, indifferent as cities always are, yet touched faintly by the echo of her passing. To speak of her death is also to speak of her survival. For Gloria Swanson had outlived not only many of her contemporaries, but also the very form of cinema that had created her. She had lived to see silent film become history, to see her own works preserved in archives, to see her own image projected not as novelty, but as legend. Few stars endure so long, fewer still endure with such dignity. Her passing marked not only the end of her life, but the closing of an age that she had once defined. There is a poignancy in imagining her last days, the photographs at her bedside, the echoes of applause lingering faintly in her memory, the quiet rhythms of her disciplined life continuing even as time wore thin. Perhaps she looked back not with regret, but with wonder, astonished at the sheer vastness of her journey, from a girl in Chicago to a goddess of cinema, from extravagance to exile, from silence to resurrection. Perhaps she understood at last that her life had been both gift and burden, and that the paradox of her existence was itself her legacy. When the obituaries called her Hollywood's eternal diva, they were not wrong. For Gloria Swanson had lived as though divinity were possible, demanding reverence, commanding attention, surrounding herself with grandeur, refusing to diminish. Yet she was also deeply human, scarred by loss, wounded by betrayal, haunted by solitude. To remember her is to remember both goddess and woman, myth and flesh, brilliance and sorrow. Let us pause at her grave where a single rose rests upon the stone, left perhaps by an admirer, perhaps by a stranger who wished to honor the memory of a name. The air is quiet, the city hums beyond, and in that quiet the rose becomes a symbol of her legacy, fragile, beautiful, fading, yet never forgotten. And from this rose we move into our final reflection, the last chapter of her story. For to speak of Gloria Swanson is not only to recount the events of her life, but to consider her legacy, the meaning of her art, the strange alchemy by which she became immortal. The projector flickers once more, casting her image against the darkness, and we are left to ask what remains of her and what she means to us still. The rose lay upon her grave, its petals already softening at the edges, and in that simple gesture of remembrance, the whole paradox of Gloria Swanson's life seemed contained. For she had lived as though roses might bloom eternally, as though beauty itself were immune to decay, and yet even roses wither, and yet, too, the memory of roses, like the memory of stars, lingers long after their petals have fallen. So it is with her. The world that once bowed before her image has long since moved on, new idols risen, new stories told. But Gloria remains, her name spoken not merely as a figure of history, but as a presence woven into the very fabric of cinema's dream. To speak of her legacy is to walk among shadows and lights, for she was not only a woman of brilliance, but also of sorrow. She embodied the glamour of the jazz age with a command that no one rivaled. Yet she also bore the scandals, the heartbreaks, the humiliations of financial ruin. She was adored as a goddess, yet she wept as a woman who longed for love. She stood triumphant in Sunset Boulevard, yet she was forever bound to its haunting, as though her immortality demanded that she carry Norma Desmond's madness as her own. And perhaps it is precisely in this paradox that her legacy lies, in the recognition that brilliance and tragedy cannot be separated, that to shine so fiercely is also to burn, that to command adoration is also to pay for it with solitude. Her films, those flickering reels of the silent era, still bear her imprint. To watch her in DeMille's spectacles, adorned in pearls, her chin lifted with serene command, is to witness the art of silent cinema at its peak. She spoke without words, yet her face carried volumes, her presence filling the screen with an authority that silence could not diminish. She was the proof that cinema could be not only entertainment, but ritual, that an actress could be not merely admired but revered. And though many silent films have vanished, her image endures, preserved on celluloid like an eternal flame. And then, of course, there is Sunset Boulevard, that strange doubling of art and life. It has ensured her immortality, though it bound her forever to the image of decline. When audiences today speak her name, they often think first of Norma Desmond, that ghost wandering her decaying mansion, those blazing eyes declaring readiness for a close-up. It is a cruel irony, perhaps, that the film that restored her also confined her, that the role that crowned her once more also shackled her to tragedy. Yet what is immortality if not a paradox? And perhaps Gloria herself, proud as ever, would have accepted it, knowing that to be remembered even in tragedy is still to be remembered, still to live in the minds of those who gaze upon the screen. Her legacy also lies in the idea of survival. She endured when others vanished. She reinvented herself when the world turned its back. She lived through scandal, through heartbreak, through the collapse of silent cinema, through the fickle cycles of Hollywood, and she remained herself. Always disciplined, always proud, always commanding, she refused to allow the world to diminish her. Even in exile, she carried herself as a queen. Even in obscurity, she preserved her dignity. She was not only a star of cinema, but a symbol of resilience, of the will to endure against the erosion of time. And beyond the films, beyond the scandals, beyond the myths, she leaves us questions. What is fame? What does it mean to be adored by millions yet held by none? What does it mean to live as an image, to be remembered not for one's true self, but for the illusions one has created? These are not questions only for Gloria Swanson, but for all who seek greatness, all who long for immortality. In her story, we glimpse the cost of glory, the loneliness of brilliance, the paradox of being both goddess and woman. Let us imagine, then, a final scene. A projector whirs in a darkened room, casting a beam of light across the dust-filled air. Upon the screen appears Gloria, luminous in silence, her eyes commanding, her presence eternal. The audience is hushed, caught in the spell of her image. Outside, the world continues, indifferent. But within that room, for that moment she lives again, as radiant as she ever was. The reel flickers, the images tremble, the film ends. The light fades, yet the memory remains. So too does she remain, not only in reels preserved in archives, not only in the haunting brilliance of Sunset Boulevard, but in the minds of all who have pondered her story. Gloria Swanson is not merely a chapter of Hollywood's past. She is the embodiment of its paradoxes, its triumphs, its sorrows, its illusions, and its truths. She is the eternal diva, scandalous and tragic, brilliant and wounded, radiant and alone. She is the rose upon the grave, fragile and fading, yet also eternal in memory. And so we close the tale, leaving her not in sorrow but in contemplation, with the gentle flicker of a projector beam fading into darkness. For as long as cinema endures, Gloria Swanson endures, a goddess who lived among us larger than life, yet bound always by the same frailties that bind us all.